Hi everyone, welcome. In most cases, you don't see me wearing a glove on my right hand, only my left hand, but today I'm doing the same thing as we did when we checked in on these little guys 14 days ago, is that we're going to use both hands, I'm going to use both hands, to administer feeding number 20 to these little guys. The system's 234 days old today. Easy numbers to remember, 2, 3, 4, 2 weeks, feeding 20. And I'm trying to remember if there was one other statistic that I usually share, which I might not be remembering offhand, but it's not important. Maybe it'll come to me later. So what we did in here 48 days ago, I think that was the other statistic that I wanted to try to remember, was that we initiated what I have been referring to lately as the fed foraging phase. And in the past, when I would think about setting my systems up for foraging, it would mean that I'm giving them nothing new. And that means no food, no bedding, no grit, no nothing. But more recently, I've been including feedings even after a system has been switched over to foraging phase, with the foraging phase having the primary goal of giving the worms a chance to work down residual bedding in the system so that what we're left with is a whole bunch of really clean castings, debris-free castings. And then the other thing that we did recently, which I don't really recall the amount of time on, is the switch of the layout of the system to be in a wedge type of a wedge configuration. I broke this piece of avocado pit and the other piece flew off the table in that direction. Perhaps if I remember, I'll go fetch it. So what we did last time, which I want to do a little bit more of today, was collect up some of the twine rope that this system was built out of and use that twine rope as supplementary bedding to reinforce the feeding over on the edge that we've been feeding. So the wedge really just implies that, the same way a wedge has kind of a large end and a narrow end. Depends on how you look at it, but I guess if you think of it in terms of food, the most food is over on this side, the minimal amount of food is on this side, presumably leading to worms wanting to gravitate towards the opposite side of the system where the feedings are getting regularly put in. Although as we go through this edge of the system opposite of where the feedings have been getting put in, you can still see a good many worms hanging out. More than happy to stay here. And there is still food bits here. I can see various scraps of this and that. So I guess it'll just take some time before the worms find nothing of interest on this side and make their way over to the opposite edge. I'm going to aerate, but at the same time I'm going to do my best to try to pick out fragments of the twine rope bedding that the system was constructed out of. And we're going to do a little bit more of what I did during the last check-in, which was take the twine, if it's still a large fragment, and unravel it. And then once we have a nice collection of unraveled twine, we're going to use that as the foundation for today's feeding. And as you saw, the feeding is going to be a pretty generous one. It's probably an amount that I would normally feed to 2 systems. But since it's been 14 days since the last check-in, and that might have been the last stat that I might not have rattled off earlier. Oh no, 2 weeks. I think I mentioned it in a different way. I think I might have mentioned how it was 2 weeks since the last check-in. It could be that they're ready for some more food. But we'll take a look at what's happening over in the feeding zone on the opposite edge when we get there. Before we do that, though, what I did last time was I got about this far, picking chunks of rope out, and that's part of the reason I don't think I found a whole lot until now that I've kind of gotten through the section that I've already collected as much rope and twine out of as I could. This here is not twine, though. This is actually what I thought was a cotton rope, or the string actually, that you get in a bakery when they tie shut a box in which a cake or some sort of pastries might have been placed. And I don't remember when it went in, but it's been a few check-ins ago, and it seems like the stuff is holding up pretty good. Perhaps it's not as compostable as I thought it was. So as we continue to work our way inwards, I assume I'll eventually start bumping into more and more fragments of twine that we could add to our little collection. And then perhaps I'll just take a little break, or at least give you guys a break, and shut off the camera, and I'll do a little bit of unwinding of the twine before we place it down into the feeding zone. Because it does seem to me like if you take a really large chunk of twine and you cut the worms loose on it, a few worms might work their way into the twine, into the tight winds of the material. But I would say that for the most part, other than perhaps one or two adventurous worms that might get down into it, for the most part the material is going to not see a great deal of worm traffic, and as a result not get broken down a great deal. And if you're like me, and you probably are, you really want to see the materials that go into your system and the materials that make up your system get broken down over time. So when stuff has been just sitting around, like a lot of this twine has been, over the entire lifespan of the system, 234 days now, then you start thinking to yourself, well, you know, I wonder if I could do something to help the material along a little bit. And it did seem to me like the most sensible thing to do with this twine was to unravel it so that it's not like this tightly wound material that the worms can't get to the middle of, but rather a much looser material, all exposed to worm traffic, so they could use it as bedding, they could use it as food. Ideally as both, but ultimately the idea is that it gets broken down. So food is the objective that I would like to strive for in terms of making it into something easier for the worms to break down. And it does seem like I've not located a whole lot of twine so far. My guess is that as we get closer and closer to the opposite edge, we'll start bumping into more of it. Some of the stuff that this system was made up of was very thick chunks of twine. And it's those really thick chunks that I think would benefit the most from being broken up a little bit. You know, and I guess in the back of my mind, I guess what's starting to go through my mind here a little bit is, why am I not finding as much as I thought I would? I mean, last time it was all right there for the picking. Just reach in and out would come a nice large chunk of twine ready for me to unwind it and unravel it. And now we're finally starting to bump into some of it. So I really had this feeling like I had only extracted twine from the very, very far edge of the system, opposite of where the feedings have been going in, but perhaps I went further than I remembered. So now I'm starting to finally find a few chunks. And I guess the other possibility is that the worms have just been working the stuff down, leaving less and less of it for me to bump into along the way. But you got to admit, this system is a busy, busy bin. There are just worms everywhere. The moisture is really, really nice too, everywhere. Very comfortable. So that piece of cardboard wrapped in plastic that's been serving as our cover for this system has been doing a really great job hanging on to the moisture, holding the moisture in, preventing it from being lost to evaporation, but at the same time allowing for ventilation around its edges. Apparently just the right blend of both to result in a fairly nice, comfortable spot for the worms to live in. And it is really starting to seem to me like all this stuff that we've tilled through so far is pretty much free of any of the rope twine that was used to build the system originally. But now, as we start approaching the feeding zone, we're definitely encountering some more larger size bits. So, I I guess we just have to decide when to stop fishing out pieces of string or rope to be unraveled. And then I'll shut the camera off, take a quick little pause so that I can prep all that stuff to be dropped into the feeding zone as the foundational bedding for today's feeding. And in a way, it would be nice if we were to gather all of the large chunks of remaining twine rope in here and place it into the feeding zone. In fact, I am starting to encounter stuff which appears to be unwound already, so we could already have made it to the section of the bin where the feedings have been getting placed ever since we switched over to the wedge method, or the wedge pattern. So perhaps it is break time. All I really want to do is grab some of these larger chunks of rope and unravel them, so when I turn the camera back on, we'll have a nice collection of twine, and then we'll pick up where we left off, setting up the feeding zone and getting this check-in completed. So, break time. See you in a moment when we got a nice collection of twine to work with. So, this is my collection of unraveled twine. I did find a couple of the thicker pieces, which when you unwind them result in 3 more strands. Each that would be possible to be unwound into yet 3 smaller strands. And then if you take that smallest strand and you start unwinding that, you're really just left with the fibers, I think. I think it was only 2 unwinds or 3 unwinds. So let's just pick up where we left off. So I had excavated up until this point, and we've at this point gone through about 2/3 of the system, picking out any chunks of twine that we could find and unraveling all of it. And what remains now, if we continue to press in that direction, is what has for now some time been the feeding zone. And you know, a lot of times when I decide it's time to migrate the worms, I'll set up something similar to this, which is what I refer to as a horizontal migration feeding zone. So it's a feeding zone with the intent of getting the worms to migrate. This is very, very similar to that in that it, you know, focuses the feeding on one side and eventually does end up with material on the opposite side, which is for the most part free of food and bedding, and eventually you might also want to start driving it towards being free of moisture. And it's at that point that the worms will definitely start looking for a different place to be. But what this really is meant to simulate what some people do, running their bins is the wedge type of configuration. Some people, I think before the term wedge got coined, I think a lot of people would just continue it as like a continuous flow setup, so that you can continue to add new stuff to this side, and then once the opposite side has become depleted of any bedding, food, moisture, you can actually start picking the finished castings right out of there, with the assumption that the majority of the worms are no longer even over there, but they're at the opposite end where all the goodness is. So along the way we found little bits of stuff which I kept placing over there. I figured if we can check out a couple of the larger objects before we reset the feeding zone, then we could. There was a mango seed. Here's a pumpkin stem. This could be more avocado pit, and that reminds me, I've got to go pick up that piece that flew away. So now I've actually moved some material. Here's another pumpkin stem. A lot of moisture in here. So I've moved some stuff away from the far edge, which I think does include a few larger bits of rope that I can possibly unwind during the next check-in and reuse as the bedding to accompany the feeding. But for now, I think we're going to proceed with grabbing our nice collection of collected stuff over here, and perhaps I'll grab a handful of it back to use as covering and what remains over there can be the foundation onto which we can drop today's fairly generous feeding. So let's get that in here now. All right, that looks pretty thorough. Let's see how this stuff fits. All right, so this is where I start getting pretty awkward, because I'm used to always having my right hand completely clean. And since that's not the case today, I'm gonna kind of improvise my way through here hopefully without making a huge mess. So I left a few chunks of food over there, which I'm gonna see if I could fish out, and the accompanying coffee filter that came with this portion of coffee, we'll use that as our customary indicator to show where we last fed, although I think we would have very little difficulty finding our way back to where we last fed. Some good sized chunks of carrot in here. These are all the leaves of radish, which, once again, I suspected that I might have put these leaves away with the rubber band still holding the leaves together, because I knew that in a previous bunch that I fed not too long ago I made the same error. And I just came from the farmer's market and I bought a couple bunches of radishes home. So I figured before I stick more radish leaves in the freezer for future worm bin feedings, it might be a good idea to actually do away with the radish leaves that are still sitting here in my freezer. So if you ask me, that right there is a really nice, generous feeding for the wormies, which we can now proceed to cover up with the remaining twine, unraveled twine that we prepared. And if you ask me, that looks pretty good. So if you really want this to look like a wedge, it actually does now look like a wedge, just based on how thick the material is here, how deep it is. Not thick, but I wasn't really aiming to achieve that here, but you know, why not? Why not just leave it? It shouldn't be a problem. It'll actually start to look actually like a wedge, with a shallower end on this side and a much deeper end on that side. And then on top of the feeding zone goes the feeding zone indicator. So I have succeeded in keeping a portion of my pinky finger clean here. And that's really all I was after, so that when the time comes to shut off the camera, I have at least one unsoiled digit with which to manipulate the camera's controls. And you can even see here I got a little bit messy, getting a little bit of material onto the piece of cardboard that's been cleaned forever. So whatever, it happens. It's a little bit of a messy game, but when you want to get both hands in it, you got to expect to get a little bit dirty. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. I got a few things to take care of getting cleaned up, put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before I go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, let's see if I can do this without making a mess. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.